Can you hear me okay? All right, excellent. You're in the front row, of course you can hear me fine. All right, so today we're going to kind of do a little live experiment where we're going to try to get something a bit more complex in Hello World. So I like to call it a MVP because it's not a prototype, because we could probably convince someone to give us money for this. It's Silicon Valley, it's Google. So why Flutter? And I think this XKCD kind of sums up really the kind of maybe last decade in like mobile cross-platform. Because really early on you had PhoneGap and a lot of the kind of jQuery mobile solutions, and they worked okay-ish, but the phones were incredibly CPU limited, so you didn't really get particularly far with them. So is Flutter really any different? Well, let's have a look at the two major competing kind of cross-platform solutions that there are at the moment. So you've got Xamarin, and Xamarin works pretty well. But you do run into limitations, and the limitations that you tend to run into is in this middle section here, where you need to communicate between the two runtimes. So you've really got two programs running in separate processes on your device, which then need to synchronize up. But not only are they running in separate processes, but they're both trying to control each other in some way. So you always end up synchronizing across this bridge between these two processes. So you can get pretty far with Xamarin in this respect, but you will kind of hit this brick wall at some point where either the bindings don't exist for something, or it's just not performant enough. And there's no way to really get it to go to like that kind of nth degree in terms of performance because of this separation of runtimes. React Native kind of has the same problem, but we've got more runtimes, especially on Android. So on Android, you've got your C++ runtime, you've got your JavaScript runtime, and you've got the Java runtime. So you've got three different runtimes which need to communicate with each other. And this is where that 15th standard comes in from the XKCD comic. And the way in which Flutter deals with synchronizing with the UI is that it doesn't. They made their own one. So Flutter's solution is this kind of stack that you can see here. So Skia is the 2D rendering engine that's in Chrome. And you can get Chrome on iOS and Android, and it works really well. So the foundation is just a bunch of like native bindings and allows Flutter to talk to the C++ runtime. And then on top of that, we've got the gestures, rendering, and widgets. And it's these widgets which allow us to get rid of that problem that we ran into with Android and iOS, where we had to synchronize between our kind of effectively a logical runtime with our presentation runtime. So in Flutter, those things are unified, so we don't have to worry about that. But not only that, but we can optimize it so that the rendering engine performs in ways that the platforms didn't originally anticipate. So we can perform optimizations and deploy upgrades to our UI library just by upgrading our application. So that's kind of the reasoning behind my journey into Flutter. I originally started in Xamarin and then but I found the tooling too unstable, and especially for Android, it would take a really long time for the tooling to be upgraded to the latest releases from Google. Then React Native, and again, you still run into that same problem, and React Native is dynamically typed, and for me, I've kind of come to really appreciate a good type system. Now, Dart in Flutter is optionally typed, so if you're used to TypeScript, it's a little bit like that, where if you annotate everything with types, you do get that safety. But you may run into edge cases still where, because Dart was originally dynamically typed, you may find some things don't quite gel well with your type system. So that's enough about reasoning. You came here to see me write a live program. Right. So the first thing we need in the Flutter program is this void main function here. And in here, we're going to pass the root widget of our application. Now in Flutter, everything on the UI is referred to as a widget. In fact, the widgets actually get used for pretty much everything, because with the widgets, you have the ability to compose and nest them. So we can see here we've got the scaffold, which gives us everything around the edge. And then in there, we just got this body. So if we go into our little logon page here, which at the moment just says Hello Sydney. That text might be a bit small, but things will get bigger later. So in here, we've got our widget, which is going to be a stateful one. So there's two types of widgets in Flutter. You've got a stateless widget, which just takes input from the parent and just renders. And then you've got a stateful widget. So a stateful widget can tell itself to update, and the build function that we see here will be called again. So if we wanted to, we could add like a counter here. I'll do a little bit of live stuff. Oh, the alarm. Can we turn the sound from the laptop off? Or is that the microphone? I think I'm bumping the microphone. So let's say we want to add a button just here. So we need to add a column to allow us to add multiple children. It's not happy with me. Alright, so we'll do this. So we go raise button. I'm just going to give it a child that says and whenever we press the button, we're going to call this set state, which will allow us to re-render our UI. So count plus equals 1. What am I doing wrong? Oh, because I put that inside the build function, so it keeps overriding itself. There you go. So if it was a stateless function, the parent would have to either be stateful and then tell its children to update. So if you ever use something like React, you will find that the model is fairly similar. So let's get rid of this, and we'll continue down. Going to start by having a logon form. So every good app needs a logon form so we can get people's email addresses, right? So the first thing we're going to start with is we're going to center the control. So this puts the controls center horizontally, and then we're going to use the column to then stack the children on top of each other here. So I might. So we've got this email field here. So if we're just going to open it up. So the email field here is a stateless widget. And we're going to pass in the text editing controller. And the text editing controller is another widget which allows us to get the text out of the actual text input, the text field here. So when we build our text field, we're going to pass in our controller, which we pass in via the constructor. We're going to tell it we want it to be an email, and we're going to tell it not to capitalize. Occasionally I find apps where I'll start typing in my email address and I'll capitalize my name, and it's a little bit frustrating. And then we're going to use our input decoration to remove any of the borders and give us the ability to have a hint. If we remove the decoration here, you'll see that the email field has disappeared. So you can see even though as I type, things will be updated. So one of the good things about Flutter in the developing mode is that as you're kind of prototyping your app out, the app will hot reload every time you save the file. If you're running it from the command line, you have to actually press a command to do it, but if you run it from the debugger in either Visual Studio Code or Android Studio, you'll be able to get the updates live. So now if I go back, so password field is pretty much the same, but if we want to obscure the text in the password field, we need to say the obscure text is true. Now, if we make the password field a stateful widget, we could add one of those little eyes at the end here, which allow us to kind of reveal the password after we've typed it. Yeah, I'm going to take that out, so if I mistype something, I can actually see what the hell is happening. And so now, to stack the views horizontally, so the column will allow us to stack them vertically, like think of it like a column. And so with the row, we can pass in a set of children. Now, this button here I've wrapped inside and expanded. So when you expand when you give a collection and expand it, like the row and column, it will have that child fill as much space as it possibly can. So if we took this raise button here and we moved it out, so can I do this without breaking something? Yeah, so you can see the button now only takes up as much space as it needs for the text. Autoflow is being helpful. And so with the button, we're just going to pass in a text field, and in the onPressed, we're going to get the email controller to give us the text, and we're just going to make it all lowercase and trim, just in case for whatever reason your database has been encoded for case sensitive. And the password we're just going to grab as is. So what we're going to do is when we click any of these buttons to sign in, we want it to show us like a dialog. So if I just do name at name, but not type password in, then our snack bar is not showing. Yay! Anyway. So what should be happening is that, I know why, because I only did it for the registration, which apparently I did wrong for some reason. So you can see here, even with the error, the app is still running and the snack bar is being shown. So I've probably this is probably null or something. And so there's a few ways in which you can kind of separate out the different widgets from each other. So you can actually wrap the widgets in padding. So if we did this, the widgets can be right next to each other. So if you can wrap them in padding, and then we want to do padding edge insert all 16. Oh wow. Oh, because I'm putting the padding around the expanded. But yeah, as you can see, that's a little bit tricky. So you're better off using these size boxes, which is just these like empty views, which allow us to put white space into our application. Why are you not happy with me for some reason? I've upset it in some way. All right, so let's go on to the next one. So let's actually see if our sign in will work. All right, so I've just taken a little form and made it into a little widget here. So our app is unhappy. All right, let's restart it. happy because it crashed. Alright, so I'll explain what this scaffold here is doing. So at the very top of our application, we've got this scaffold element. Now any widget anywhere down inside your tree can say, give me a widget somewhere above me using my context. So the context will tell the Flutter where the widget is in the hierarchy, and it will then traverse the tree until it finds a scaffold. And so the scaffold allows us to kind of show these snack bars so we can have little pop-ups on our application. Well, that's not good. Let's see if Android's happier. While we try to get Flutter to... Ugh. What happened there? Alright, what if I just go back? Yes, I want you to do that. Alright. So let's just keep going. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be using Firebase in this example to kind of just have it so that we don't have to worry too much about our backend. So we're going to have the Firebase sign in with an email and password that we got from our controller. One thing I would say, if you're learning Dart, the catch error has to come immediately after the feature. If you put it further down the chain like you would with JavaScript promises, it doesn't actually get invoked and you will lose the exception and it will bubble up and crash your application. So this took me a while to work out because I've never actually seen anything where you have a future implementation where the order actually mattered on the callbacks that you put onto it. So in this case, we're just going to, if we get an error, we're just going to say that the registration failed with the email address. If the registration succeeds, we're going to show the user's email. So we're just going to pass our function into our form here. So if we go down to it, we can see what we've got here. So by default, name parameters that you pass to a class aren't actually mandatory. So if you don't actually pass them, they'll implicitly become null. If you do want named arguments to be mandatory, you can annotate them with the @required. And so this is just the form that we had before, but I've moved into a widget. So now let's look for our little thing. So this dot is just a shorthand for assign this parameter to the constructor to our field down here. Now these fields are all public by default because you don't have public and private in Flutter. You actually have an underscore. So the underscore means it's private. But we're not going to worry about for this. So whenever the sign in is pressed, we're going to invoke the sign in callback, which will then fire that Firebase login that we saw above. So we'll see if the application is going to come back for us. We've got a backup application we can have a look through if this one decides it doesn't like us. So, go back up. Now, I don't know how good your memory is, but one of the things that we had before was that the form was kind of pushing against the edges of our application. So in this case, we're just going to use the padding that I tried to use earlier, but in this case, I'm using it correctly. And we're going to have the edges be padded by 16 point on all sides. There's a few other things you can do: vertical and horizontal padding, so it's pretty standard, hopefully. So in this case, we're going to just fix up a little form a little. Now, this, are you going to be on? No, that's something else. Let's see. I think it started over here. We have something. Alright, so let's see if we can log in now. So name at, so it's an account I set up earlier. It's not crashing. Okay. So we'll close that one. Or reload. Ah, that's better. Yeah, so the future not being very helpful for us here. All right. So, oh, there it went. You know what the problem is? I'm using this conference Wi-Fi instead of my 4G. Oh, so the room is terrible for Wi-Fi. Okay. So, the login does work apparently. So now we should actually be hopefully be able to move forward. But logging in and printing out like the user's hash ID here is great, but we really want to have the user be kind of drive the session for our application. And this is where we start to move into the way in which you manage state in a Flutter application, which is to using this thing called what Google calls the block pattern, which they say is meant to mean the business logic components. And so what these are is basically just a state store. So it's just a regular class, and we're just going to have our Firebase authentication here. And then we're just going to have a behavior subject. So if you're familiar with any of the RX libraries, the behavior subject basically says that anytime somebody subscribes to get the user, give them the most current user that we have. If we don't have a user yet, just when we get one, then push that user down to any subscribers that we have. And then we're going to publicly expose a stream, and there we're just going to broadcast our behavior subject to anyone subscribing to it. So when we construct a block, we're going to get any existing current users. So Firebase will actually store the user session on disk. And for some reason it managed to survive the app being destroyed and reinstalled, and I don't know how it did that. Flutter does, and Dart for that matter, does have asynchronous programming. So if you're familiar with the C# async await, it's very much the same kind of thing. So in Firebase authentication, if the current user doesn't exist, then we can assume that they haven't logged in before. So we're just going to sign them in anonymously. If they have signed in before, we're just going to return the user immediately. If we get an exception, we're just going to print it. If we don't get an exception, don't change that, then we're going to add the user to our session. Now, we probably could have the behavior subject limit the amount of users that we've logged in, or even just use like a static variable in some respects. But for this purposes, we're going to use a stream because it'll be helpful later in showing some things. So we then have the functions that were inside our callbacks before. So if we require, if you've logged in, you can pass the user directly into here. But if you want to log in with the email, we just get the Firebase instance and sign in with the email and password. And then with the registration, we're just going to register the user. And so how do we get access to this from our widgets? And the way in which we do that is we create a widget that extends the inherited widget. And these inherited widgets are the ones where we can, anywhere in the widget hierarchy, request a widget from above us. So the mechanism for traversing the tree up to find a widget, the widget has to extend these inherited widgets. So we're just going to have a private instance of our block. Update should notify is a more kind of callback way of notifying the children of the tree as to when something has changed, but because we're using Rx and streams, we don't actually need this, and frankly this is at the root of our application, so we can just say true, and it's only ever going to really happen once. And this inherited from widget of exact type, which allows us to pass in the context to get this widget, which we're going to put at the root of our application, grab the session provider, and then because we're inside the class here, we can access this private member. Now, for testing reasons, you can either pass in the block or we'll create one if you don't. So now we can go back to our main application here. And so if we uncomment that, we go back to our login. Oh. And this is how we get the session provider. So this is the mechanism by which when we log into the user, we can provide the user globally to our application. And because the session provider is at the root of our application, so that's actually not particularly helpful, so let's have this one. Yeah, so you can see when I added the user, we now get this kind of session here. I'm just actually jumping ahead slightly. So because we logged in before, so I'm going to log out quickly so we don't see spoilers. So I'm going to show the that's right. I set up my Wi-Fi. Let me change Wi-Fi's. Yeah, I've got a very sweet Wi-Fi. So in our logout page here, we just got really just that centered button that we saw before. And when we press it, we're going to get our session provider and call the logout. The logout is just going to get the Firebase authentication and sign out. We're going to await it. And then we're just going to add the anonymous user again. So we'll just have to deal with the slow Wi-Fi. That's fine. And then we're just going to log out. Now, how did I have that kind of switch from one to the other like we saw a minute ago? So now if we go to our home, which is the new one I set up, I believe, let's see. Yeah, home page. So I've got a container, and then I've got this stream builder here. So the stream builder is listening to whenever the user is being changed. So whenever the user is being changed, what we're going to do is we're going to say, we're going to wait for someone to sign in. So when we start the application, that block is going to be initialized with the anonymous user. So when the app starts up, you could have that be like a splash screen. And in this case, we're just going to wait for that anonymous user sign in to happen. Until then, we're just going to show a loading text field in the middle. Once the user has signed in, if they have an account which isn't anonymous, we're going to take them to that schedule page that we saw before. So the app I'm building here is going to be a little really simple schedule listing of the conference. So if they are anonymous, we're going to come to this login page. So let's actually make a new user. So we're just going to go. Okay, thank you. I have no idea where that came from. Let's hope it's still running. So let's say world's most secure password. Troy will be proud. And yeah, so we signed in with our user. So if we go back to our home screen here earlier, so once we've signed in with any kind of user who isn't the anonymous user and we actually have a user in some respect, then we're going to construct this tabs page here. So the tabs page will allow us to kind of see our agenda for the conference, as well as log out, and so allow us to log into another user. And so what we need to do for this tab bar down the bottom is we need to define a bottom navigation bar item. And here we're just going to use the default icons that come with Flutter. So we can actually change this to be something else. So like Wi-Fi is being very fun, so let's change it to be the Wi-Fi. And then, whatever. It's a bit unhelpful. So we can open up our schedule. So the way in which we're switching between the tabs is that we're just going to keep track of which tab is currently active. And then we're going to call this build screen function here. This function basically just says if it's the 0 index, we want to show the schedule. If it's anything else, we want to show our logout page. So as soon as you tap on any of these tabs down the bottom, we're going to update the tab index, and that's going to have the build function reevaluate, and then that will then rebuild the screens that we have on here. So now if we go into our schedule application, we can see how I've built these little screens. And again, we're using Firebase to pull all the data down. So again, we're going to, because it's returning a stream, we're going to use a stream builder. So we're going to get our talks collection, and we're going to order it by the order in which they appear in the agenda. While we're waiting for data to appear, we're just going to show the text. We're then going to get the amount of talks that we do have, and then we're going to pass it to our list view builder here. So the list view builder will allow us to construct this big long list here that we can see. So you can see even just in debug mode, this is performing quite well. Except for that bit. I think this is trying to download images and failing because of the Wi-Fi. So if the Wi-Fi is not loading images properly, let's have a look at our schedule rows. So before I get ahead of myself, so if we get in the document from Firebase, and we're going to pass it to this builder function, and we're just going to pull out all the data that's coming back from Firebase, and then put it into a nice typed way, so we're not having to like try to remember and type the same string over and over. So our scheduled row here, so each one of these views is called a card, and that's right, it crashed, didn't it? Let's turn off the images. So cache network image. Alright. So we won't get people's faces, but it shouldn't crash with the Wi-Fi in this room being as helpful as it is. So Firebase is actually doing quite well because it's downloaded all the stuff and cached it locally before, which is why all the talk content here is still accessible, but the images are causing the app to crash because our cache network image provider is obviously not handling network failures properly. Did you write that? No, there's someone else wrote that. I should open up a bug for them. I'm like, you ruined my presentation. Is that emulator readable for people? Yeah, cool. So in this sense, all right, so let's just go through what I've got here with this thing. So we've got the card, which is a material kind of UI design construct, which basically says we want to have this nice little floating card here. And then we're just going to stack everything on top of each other. So we're going to have the talk title kind of sitting on the top, where we're just going to have the time and the venue. So the keynote was at 9 in room 1, room 2, room 3, 4, 5. And then we're just going to add a bit 4-point spacing between the title and the Whoever is at Apple decided that a huge touchpad was a good thing. Must have tiny hands, because I always palm that thing. So here's another fun thing we can do. So at least with the material application, so you can also use the Cupertino, which is the iOS styling. But at least with the material application, we always have this theme object in our hierarchy, so we can always traverse up the hierarchy and get the theme object. So this will allow us to have consistent theming that we can have for our application throughout. But for whatever reason, if we want to deviate in certain areas, we can copy the theme and then update the individual properties that we want. So instead of having the font weight of 500, in this case, for the talk title here, we can have the font weight of 600. I'm just going to space it out again, and then we're going to have the first few lines of the preamble for a talk. Now, one thing I didn't actually try to do before coming to this was navigation. So navigation is not particularly hard. So because we don't have that, let's actually try and add that now. So we've got what have I called it? Speaker details, and I was going to pass in just the speaker. So in this case, if we click on the speaker here, we want to navigate to a detailed view of the speaker. So if we go down, let's just make a new file actually. So we're going to go to speaker details. And we're just going to do a stateless widget. Alright. That's going to be unhappy until I import material. So we do a column, and we're just going to do something really simple to start with. Just going to do a bunch of texts here. So let's pass in our speaker object. So we're going to take a speaker, add it to our constructor, and we need to import it from the other file. So now we could do speaker dot full name. So let's just start with that. So if we go back to here, whenever we tap on the speaker, we're going to call the navigation push function. We're going to give it our context. Now, if we just pass this as is, it won't actually work, because every screen in the material application actually needs to be wrapped inside a scaffold. So we're just going to do a scaffold. So we won't worry about the title bar. And if we go back to the schedule here, save that. And now if I click on down here, well, title bar would have been helpful because it wouldn't have had the name appear right behind the text. So let's go back to our details screen here, and let's, instead of container, let's just center them. And let's so main axis alignment, so because it's a column, that's the vertical one, and we want it to be in the center. There we are. So if in a few minutes we've gone from having a login screen to a schedule to having like proper kind of like session management. Now, does anyone want me to like do anything else? Because we've got a few minutes, so I guess we could mob program the rest of this little experiment.
social networking can do that.
Social networking? So what do you mean, like opening up in Twitter or something?
Yeah, maybe sharing to Twitter. How about that?
Oh, okay. I don't actually have Twitter set up on the simulator. The Wi-Fi is being so slow that logout actually hasn't happened yet. Oh, there we are. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
So, I haven't done much with Flutter yet, but I'm very interested. So I see there's lots of choices, or people talking about choices of state machines. Do you have an opinion on what type of state machine, like block pattern versus redux and so forth?
Yeah, so the question is like, there's a few different options in terms of like, having state machines. So I guess this is similar to like in React where you've got like the whole set state versus the props flowing down through the application. I would say in terms of state management, so like if a little email form here, I would be managing things like validation locally inside the form. So have the form be stateful and then manage that kind of stuff locally. Now, if they hit the submit button and you want to show something somewhere else outside of the widget, then maybe elevate that event somewhere up. So you don't need to go all the way to having like Redux where you have a big event store. You could just start with the business logic components and then just kind of situate them in the logical parts of the Flutter tree that you want. So like the user session one is a good one because you can just, for the most part, put that at the root of your application for a lot of things, especially if your application requires a user session. Now, that would still allow you to do something like Redux. So you could, inside that block, have a kind of state stream. And in that state stream, we can say, here are the root level stream with the information that we need inside of it. Because you can have a stream inside of a stream, so as we go down the tree, we start to unpack each level of that stream. So I guess to answer the question is grow the complexity as you need it. So start local and then elevate up to having a block. And when you reach the limitations of blocks and coordinating the blocks becomes difficult, again, lift it up into something like a Redux.
What about styling? Is there anything like CSS or how do you change the color scheme and stuff like that?
Yes. There's actually a really fun thing with that. So, so the scaffold, I believe, is part of the material app. So if we go into here, we can do that's what I was doing. Remember this? Yeah, so with the material app, you have this theme here. And so this is Google's kind of default settings for what a light theme is. So we could actually, in this case, just do, and now we get a dark theme. So if you don't like the colors that we have in the dark theme here, you can just do copy with. Let's say you want to change like the accent color to be colors dot amber. We don't have any accent colors. What's a background color? That should make things pretty. No.
Primary. Should be primary.
Yeah, sorry. So yeah, button color. So now all the buttons by default will appear yellow. So in the if you're using the material widget set, they by default will travel up the widget tree and find the material app here, and then get the theme. Now, if you want to customize the appearance between to be more iOS for your iOS application, then you'd probably have to create a your own kind of like theme resolver for iOS. So similar to how we had our user session. So you could have a kind of platform theme, which would then decide based upon what platform you're on to either return the material theme or return a theme specific for iOS. Yeah.
And the redirect, so would every redirect need a new scaffold? Or can we use the scaffold of the home page or the parent page?
The navigation. So the navigation always needs to have that scaffold.
Can we use the parent scaffold, the one at the home page?
Probably. So let's see. I've got home here. That's a scaffold. Yeah, so you could probably use the scaffold on the parent, but you'd have to make sure that your parent always has a scaffold in it. And so the navigation won't check that your hierarchy has a scaffold. So there's nothing wrong with adding a scaffold, but if you add a scaffold and you change the title and add a title bar, so we can add a title, we'd have to log in first. So let's start the login, and by the time I finish speaking, it might have actually finished. But yes, it will use the parent one.
Okay, that would be using the context. How would we do that?
Yeah, so you pass the context to the navigation. So if we go back to our little schedule here, the first parameter to navigation.push is the context. So it will actually traverse up the hierarchy. And I believe in my home here, I actually have another scaffold. So this will actually kind of show what I meant before, where if I have a title and text, let's just leave that as saying data. See, because the scaffold is inside a scaffold, so if you add another title bar, that will be inside of it. And this would be another thing where you'd want to kind of lift like what the title would be up into that kind of root level session block. And so you publish events onto a kind of event bus by using that kind of session of context dot set title. And that would allow you to control, so when a widget becomes active, it can take control of the title by indirectly having that session block update a RX stream, which would then, in the app bar here, we could subscribe to those changes and update it. Yeah.
So I assume you've used some of the other texts that you've mentioned, like PhoneGap and all the other ways of making mobile apps.
Mm-hmm.
If you had a greenfield stand up a new stack tomorrow, would Flutter be your choice of tech?
So I have never used PhoneGap in production. So the question is, out of all the platforms I've used, which one would I pick? So if I was starting a new application, I would probably pick Flutter. I find Reacts to be incredibly difficult, especially like with list collections. Reacts really suffers from that kind of free bridge serialization problem, especially when it comes to scroll events and animations and scrolls. Xamarin can do a little bit better, especially on iOS, because Xamarin will compile down to ARM code. So Xamarin on iOS will actually perform as well as like Swift and Objective-C. But you run into limitations in Android because you have that serialization problem. So yeah, I would use it. Probably the biggest production application out there that Google always likes to talk about is the Hamilton musical companion application. So if you want to see a Flutter application live in production, that's a good use case. But yeah, so Flutter also allows you to get quite low level. So if you wanted to, you can. I've seen a few demos where people have done like kind of real-time particle effects in Flutter because it sits on top of a 2D rendering engine. So if you know how to do 2D graphics, you can just have a widget just do 2D particle effects without having to really go anywhere else outside of the framework. Yep.
How good is Flutter to adapt any new features that come with any new OS, Android or iOS?
So like the platform, like APIs and things.
Yeah.
So it has a platform API bridge, and I believe it's similar to React's one, where you basically say what API you want it to invoke, and then you give it a bunch of metadata, and it will then go down into the native space and then invoke the function for you. They have a bunch of kind of, I would say, it's getting a little bit beyond where I've actually been doing things. I'm still kind of at the high level. Yes, I believe there is ways to invoke the platform APIs, and they work quite well. Yeah.
The resulting size of the F binary, what's that like with the Flutter libraries in there? Is it adding additional, I don't know, megabytes?
Yeah, so what's the like overhead of using Flutter? It keeps changing because it's in beta. So I think at one point it was like about 16 megabytes for like Hello World, which is what you get with React Native as well. And I think Xamarin's about 10 megabytes. This also depends on how many CPU architectures you target. So on Android, you can now have the Google Play console split your APK based upon the CPU architecture, which will probably, let's assume that it's 16 megabyte. That would probably drop it to probably 8 or if not less, because a lot of that space is that native runtime. Yeah.
Do you think it's going to be like hiring Flutter developers next year in Sydney or Australia?
Well, the good thing about Flutter is it looks like JavaScript, so it's really quick and easy to learn. There is one thing in that respect I would say that trips people up, is this is a multi-line lambda. This is an abomination which doesn't work but still compiles.
So really, you wouldn't hesitate to train somebody up because
No. And
if they're a good web developer.
yeah, so well, if you're a good developer in general, you can probably pick up Flutter. So you don't have to know so much about like the native life cycles of the platforms as much, because Flutter does completely take over the entire UI rendering experience. So things like React Native still heavily suffers from how do you have the React runtime talk with navigation concepts on both Android and iOS. And there's still no real good solution, especially with animations and navigation. But because Flutter, everything's in the same runtime, and you have complete control of the rendering all the way down to like the Skia 2D rendering engine for the most part, you don't have that same limitation. So yeah, I would just grab any developer and be like, here, start this. Yep.
Does it handle all the proper Android actions and intents and all of the native features of Android like that? Especially that now that Google's pushing them quite hard.
So there's a activity in the application if you actually open up the Android code. So yeah, this is it. This is all that Flutter needs to do to get started. So if you need to listen to intents to start up different activities for different reasons, then you'd still the same way where you'd register in your Android manifest this intent. I'm interested when this happens, start this activity. Now all those activities, all those intents may be filtering to the same activity. As to how you get that information from here into Flutter, I haven't quite gotten to that point yet. But if I open this in Android Studio, probably like be able to explore the API. So shouldn't be too hard. On a related note, in the most recent versions, most recent versions of Flutter, they've recently released documentation about how you embed Flutter into an existing application. So on Android, it's not too hard because you just, well, it's just a separate activity. You just start activity and then you go running with Flutter. All right, we've only got a few minutes left. Oh, sorry, one more question.
Quick question, is Android Studio your preference, the IDE for Flutter?
Well, this is Visual Studio Code I'm using here.
Or do you prefer Code?
I prefer Code mostly for battery reasons. You can see in the last 54 minutes I've used almost half my battery. Just having Android Studio open with an emulator. Actually, the emulator is probably the biggest drain on power. But yeah, Android Studio, even though Visual Studio Code is Electron based, it still manages to use less memory than Android Studio, because Android Studio is not just Android Studio, it's also Android Studio and the Gradle daemon. And by default, I think they each want about 3 gigs if you don't change the memory arguments. So I could pick it or leave it, but for power reasons, I use VS Code. Yeah.
When do you reckon we're going to see it go version 1?
When did when did Gmail go version 1? So, in my opinion, Google beta means normal production for other people. Yeah, I'd get started now. And it's really not too hard to learn. There's a few things that will trip you up. They recently went to Dart 2, which is the thing that allows you to have proper types. But doing Kotlin, I want more typing. So hopefully in the future we'll have data race conditions. Yeah. So hopefully they continue to improve the type system, which is just a wish of mine. So whether that happens or not. And with 2 minutes to go, I think, unless anyone has any questions. But yeah, thank you for the questions. They've been quite helpful, and I hope this has shown how quickly you can get something up and running, even with really bad Wi-Fi.